I find this a really fascinating topic as someone who both has an autoimmune condition myself. I have type 1 diabetes. And then also as a reporter, I feel like I'm always looking into the massive cost to our society of chronic conditions and to individuals as well. I know that many of us had hoped that we would be able to do something like this in person at this point, but we want to make this as interactive as possible for our viewers. So as Willie mentioned, please ask questions throughout our conversation using the chat function, and I'll get to as many as possible throughout the conversation. I'm going to try to keep us as organized as possible. So if I see that your question fits with the topic, with something we're discussing, I'll try to fit it in, and I'll invite you verbally to ask your question, and the Research America folks will have your line unmuted to ask your question at that time. So with that, let's get right into this. And Janine, I want to start with you. You head up the Office of Research on Women's Health at the National Institutes of Health. And can you set the stage for us on the connection between women and chronic diseases? I know, especially with autoimmune conditions, it does impact women disproportionately. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then specifically what we know when it comes to lupus and Alzheimer's?
Sure. So great to be here. Many chronic diseases affect women more than men, and lupus and Alzheimer's disease are examples. And certainly other examples include depressive disorders, rheumatoid arthritis, others autoimmunity, as you mentioned, Paige. And in fact, in terms of numbers, about 2/3 of the people worldwide with Alzheimer's are women, both in the US and abroad. And Hispanic and African Americans are more likely to be affected by Alzheimer's as well. Regarding lupus, 90% of patients affected are women, and women of color are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop lupus. So these two conditions are certainly both emblematic of some of the challenges we're facing with chronic disease, which in general, many of them affect women more than men. Another aspect is that some of these diseases hang together in that we have this issue of comorbidities, diseases occurring together. And COVID-19 has certainly shown us that chronic disease is something we have to pay attention to all the time. And we've understood now the health disparities in that space too. But what I want to end with in this little part of my remarks is the fact that research has shown us that we need to look at sex, being male or female, as an important aspect of disease. And in terms of our knowledge gap, we tend to know less about women's health than men's health, less about female biology than male biology because of the way research was historically conducted. Fewer women were in clinical trials, and we did not in the past have a requirement for sex to be addressed in animal studies, but we do now. So we're able to make more progress.
Well, and Janine, I know we're talking about so many different conditions here, but are there any sort of general takeaways for why we see women more affected by these types of conditions?
Sure. So one of the aspects is key is the immune system in women and men are different. And we now know that those chromosomes, those X and Y chromosomes that make an individual female or male are expressed in every single cell in your body. And in each of those cells, those chromosomes affect molecular processes, subcellular processes, how those cells function. So here's an example. The immune system in women is more robust than in men. Women mount a more robust, exuberant response to viral infections, even to SARS-CoV-2. So unfortunately, because we respond robustly in our immune system, sometimes that immune system goes awry and attacks our own tissues. And that's when you're in the situation of autoimmune diseases where that immune system isn't attacking the things that you wanted to. So it's a double-edged sword, right, Paige, that immune system is more robust. But each of those chromosomes also has genes on the chromosomes that also play a role. And then also sex hormones have effects in organs beyond the sex organs. So sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone, they affect other organs and can affect susceptibility or response when a disease occurs.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. And I want to talk about the disease, the burden of these diseases on individuals and society. But first, I want to ask Ian about something you could say has been in the news a little bit lately, which is this controversial Alzheimer's drug, Aduhelm. And Ian, I'd love to get your take both on what we know about the efficacy of the drug and the FDA process of getting approved. Can you kind of walk us through how you're thinking about that?
Sure. And I just want to take a moment to thank Dr. Clayton for her explanation and add that certainly we think there are significant roles around environmental factors, lifestyle, other things that influence the disproportionate impact on women and other overrepresented populations within the Alzheimer's and dementia realm. So in terms of Aduhelm, the scientific name is aducanumab. So if I use either of those terms, I mean the same thing. It is the first FDA-approved therapy that is believed to modify or change the course of the underlying disease pathology for Alzheimer's disease specifically. So just for a little clarity off the top, let's all understand it has nothing to do with the other diseases that can result in symptoms that we call dementia. This is not for those other diseases. It is just for the Alzheimer's type. And it is intended, based on the clinical studies that were done by the sponsor company and by academic researchers, it's intended for people with mild cognitive impairment, people who do not yet have what we would clinically call dementia, but a precursor stage of cognitive impairment, or for people who have very mild dementia. That was the study population. So that's where the evidence exists. The evidence around safety and efficacy, the two things that FDA evaluates, the US Food and Drug Administration evaluate, safety and efficacy data were complicated and at a certain stage, somewhat inconclusive or even potentially negative, but then reanalysis of a larger set of patients that had been involved in the clinical studies revealed that maybe there were better safety and efficacy indications. FDA looked at that. You're right, lots of controversy in the way FDA did its review. But at the end of the day, FDA said enough to go forward. So here we are, lots of uncertainty, more studies needed, and it's a great first hopeful step for our field.
Stacey, I want to ask you about the accelerated approval pathway, because as you mentioned, Ian, that was used to approve this drug. And we know that the HHS Inspector General is currently reviewing this process of approving the drug, because there's been a lot of controversy around this. But Stacey, can you kind of walk us through how you view that pathway and sort of what it means for this particular drug and then other drugs in the pipeline?
Thanks, Paige, for that question. I think we need to start any of these sorts of considerations about what we need to do with accelerated approval by really stepping back and looking at our experiences to date. As of June, 269 drugs have received accelerated approval that extended and in some cases saved patients' lives by providing earlier access to novel therapies that just wouldn't have been possible using traditional approval pathways. I think it's also important to kind of look back at kind of the legislative intent behind accelerated approval. And we did have a recent look at that as recently as 2012 when FDASIA updated the accelerated approval provision in order to clarify the types of clinical endpoints that could be eligible for use as the basis of accelerated approval. So if you look at the findings in FDASIA, where you see some of the congressional intent, it was acknowledged that patients benefit from expedited access to safe and effective therapies for serious and life-threatening conditions. And it even went on to talk about the fact that FDA should be encouraged to implement more broadly effective processes for expediting development using a broad range of surrogate endpoints and clinical endpoints. So FDASIA was intended to enhance the authority of the FDA to consider whatever they deem as appropriate given that disease state and what they see as appropriate scientific data and methods to expedite development. So, with that foundation, I think there's a very strong history of accelerated approval demonstrating a positive impact. But also with that long history, I think you can now and say, we have a lot of experience to build upon and make improvements and even propose improvements to the program at this point in time. You could even look at the COVID-19 experiences and emergency use authorizations, and I think draw some interesting parallels there as well. When you look at those, you see that FDA may be more willing to make therapies available earlier where they feel like they have clear authority to withdraw initial approval. In the post-marketing spaces, these changes could include strengthen their ability to withdraw the drug when the trials aren't showing verifying benefit, or we could do this even perhaps by reviewing the current requirements for an informal hearing. I think there's tons of ideas out there about ideas to strengthen FDA's post-market authorities, and they've been proposed by various stakeholder groups. And I think many of these are reasonable. I think we should look at opportunities for requiring the confirmatory trials to be in progress at the time of the initial approval. And we should be looking at ways to incorporate greater use of real-world evidence to fulfill post-market data requirements. This is the time, I think, to look for those opportunities to strengthen this pathway that has a really strong and a long history in helping patients.
But just a quick follow-up, Stacey. Thank you for that answer. I'm just wondering, do you worry that the controversy over Aduhelm is going to undermine support for this accelerated pathway, or cause people to kind of rethink it, or perhaps just pursue some reforms as you've outlined?
I definitely think it will. And like I said, I think it should. I mean, regardless of Aduhelm, I think we have a lot of experience with this pathway. And even before Aduhelm was approved, there had been discussions that had been initiated because we are close to a PDUFA cycle where these conversations naturally happen. Lots of ideas are coming to the surface. So I definitely think there are opportunities to look at ways to strengthen the pathway. And I think we would welcome being part of those conversations.
Okay,
I just had a quick word on that.
Of course, go ahead.
Just to bring home Stacey's point, and she's absolutely right. There are countless people who have survived cancers, HIV, AIDS, and other incredibly important life-threatening conditions like Alzheimer's who have benefited from the accelerated approval pathway being available. There are myriad success stories. Controversy around one therapy notwithstanding, the accelerated approvals pathway is critical to America's health. And we need to seize those opportunities for Alzheimer's, lupus, other drugs as well. So let's make that system stronger, but let's not lose that system because of headlines that have sort of whipped up enormous controversy around one individual product over hundreds that Stacey references as having used this pathway.
Well, I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot more about it in the coming months, but let's turn to the burden of these two particular diseases on society. And Joy, I'm wondering if you can kind of lay out for us the impact of lupus on patients and caregivers in the US. Joy, if I could toss that question. There you go. Looks like you're unmuted now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paige, for that question. Yeah, I think, over the last decade, we've actually made some great advances in the field of lupus, including the development of 3 new drugs that have been approved specifically for the treatment of lupus. And this is huge for us. These drugs include Benlysta, Saphnelo, and Lupkynis. And that's more progress made in the last 10 years than over the past 100 years, which is really terrific. But we are really just scratching the surface in terms of what needs to be done to improve the lives of people living with lupus. It's unfortunate that we also don't have guidelines on stopping the autoimmune disease process in persons who present clinically with incomplete or probable lupus, but don't meet the defined ACR or SLIC classification criteria. And this is really problematic, especially for people who present clinically with a positive ANA or something of that nature, but don't really know where to go from there. In addition to that, when we're talking about getting a quicker diagnosis,
and Joy, actually, can I pause you there, and can you go back and explain and kind of hash that out for a little bit more, what you were talking about meeting this criteria, just for people who may not understand?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ACR criteria kind of outlines a roadmap for diagnosing lupus. So patients are typically required to meet 4 out of the 11 classification criteria. So that can be anything from, having certain serological factors to certain physical manifestations of the disease. But a lot of times patients might have those serological factors, but don't really have any physical manifestation. So essentially we characterize them as being asymptomatic. And so while it might be frustrating for the patient, especially if they might have pain or some other manifestation, it's really an opportunity for us as a field to figure out how we can intervene. And we're actually seeing studies about that right now. It's been postulated that by studying pre-stage or preclinical lupus, that we'll be able to gain a better understanding of immunological changes that occur in the stages that precede the development of SLE, or systemic lupus erythematosus, which is the type of lupus that is most life-threatening. This particular lupus impacts all organs, the kidneys, the lungs, the heart, and it's really devastating to patients and caregivers. SLE is quite debilitating, and it can cost a patient up to $70,000 a year in terms of treatment costs, as well as loss of time in the workforce. And so it's very devastating, especially over the lifespan. So a lot of investigators are now developing predictive models of progression to complete SLE based on inflammatory markers such as interferons, which the new drug Safnello is targeting, complement levels, and they're also looking at different cytokines and chemokines. Unfortunately, a lot of these studies have been done in smaller cohorts. And so what we need now is larger longitudinal studies that will help us fully understand how and when progression is occurring so that we can understand where and how to intervene. Likewise, it's going to take several different treatments to address the heterogeneous nature of a disease like lupus. And right now, what we still see today, and it's very unfortunate, is that it takes an average of 6 years and 4 doctors from when someone first shows signs of lupus symptoms until they can get an accurate lupus diagnosis. And this is simply because there are no clear diagnostic tools and treatment guidelines for lupus. And this is very unfortunate. I mean, lupus has been being studied for years, but because of its heterogeneous nature, it's very, very difficult for rheumatologists and patients to really identify that cocktail that works to improve the quality of life for a patient. And oftentimes, by the time that cocktail is identified, unfortunately, patients have been forced to quit their jobs. And as a result of that, they don't have access to those life-saving treatments. And a lot of times, a lot of our patients don't have those financial safety nets or even support systems that will allow them to acquire those newer life-saving medications. And as a result of that, we're still seeing roughly 10 to 15% of our lupus population dying prematurely. This is problematic and it's really unacceptable. And that's why we have to continue to advance the lupus research field so that we can improve the lives of patients living with lupus.
You mentioned that it's 10 to 15% of lupus patients dying prematurely. Have we seen improvement in that, though, over the last few decades? Can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So, 50 years ago, because we did not have a lot of the treatments that we do now, we were using things like corticosteroids and a lot of orphan drugs. We often saw patients dying prematurely. In addition to that, the expected 5-year, 10-year, and 15-year survival rates have improved drastically. So, we do have the ability to keep people alive because we have better treatments. But one of the things that we have to focus on now is that quality of life piece. Because patients who specifically live with things like lupus nephritis or systemic lupus erythematosus still have debilitation to the point to where they cannot work. And so while the life expectancy has improved drastically, the quality of life is still at a high level of concern for sure.
Thank you, Joy. Let's toss this to you, Sharita. From your industry lens, what role can industries and drug developers play here in educating and helping lupus patients?
Yes, I would say we play a huge role, and we've definitely seen over the years the industry step up to begin to create resources at the level that patients need them and where they need them. So I would say as an industry, our commitment must go beyond just the medicines. And, you know, I have been both a clinician as well as I've been with GSK for the last 11 years and have had the amazing opportunity of working with Benlysta, which is the only approved product right now for both lupus and lupus nephritis. And we have had an enormous opportunity over the last 10 years to really begin to partner and collaborate with advocacy groups, the community, and patients. And I would say when you start looking at the gaps that have been mentioned, really some other considerations are as well. How do we continue to empower the patient and educate the patient to begin to advocate for themselves? And what we know right now around some of the data, around 61% of patients are not fully disclosing their symptoms. And some of that is, you know, they look great on the outside, but on the inside, they're suffering. They're mothers, and they just have to push through what they're feeling. Also, it's the health system as well, ensuring that they're speaking to, they trust aspect. They have to feel as though they're speaking to a physician that they can trust. And so for us and our partnerships over the last 10 years, it has been critical and important for us to listen very intently to what the patients are saying and both what the physicians and the advocacy groups have been saying. And from the listening and from what we've heard over the years is that we know for sure that lupus is very isolating. Patients are not open in many cases and empowered to advocate. And so we've learned that in-person and online networks are critical and important to patients and can be a valuable resource and really help them emotionally deal with their lupus. And so we have worked tirelessly and very closely to really ensure that we are also putting our efforts as a pharma organization in the needs of most unmet needs, right, populations. And so we have to begin also to think about and acknowledge that there are healthcare disparities that exist and really dig and uncover why those dynamics exist. And so from a GSK perspective and an industry perspective, we've heard the loud and clear that there has been a need to increase the education of lupus patients. So when they are engaging with their HCPs, that they can advocate for themselves in an informed and educated way. So for us, and I'm giving this example because I think it's a great example of how pharma and how GSK has really worked in partnership with the community to close these gaps that have been outlined. And so what we did is we actually started a team, a nursing team of patient engagement liaisons that solely focus at the community level on educating patients on their disease along their full treatment and lupus journey. So what we've done is we've actually been able to engage over 400,000 patients through our partnerships with advocacy groups over the last few years. But in listening to the patient and listening to the caregivers, and it has been really emotional but really rewarding to see how education has empowered the patient to really go in and ultimately will be the determining factor as well around patients not having the in-organ damage that we're seeing right now. So we've created content regarding educating patients around lupus and lupus nephritis. We know that teenagers really, really struggle, right? The stats are really showing that our youngest populations are exposed to lupus and have the potential to have higher organ damage over years. And so it's really important that we start sooner educating them around their disease. We know around 50 to 70% of children with lupus will develop kidney damage over the first 2 years. And so educating them around their disease and what to look out for has been an amazing amazing content to watch and to see the teens interact with the nursing team. And then again, men living with lupus, although they're only about 10% of the cases of lupus, they do get more serious lupus. And for them, they feel extremely isolated because when you look at all of the marketing content and what's out there, it's very women-centric. And so to begin to create content to better educate men as well has been rewarding. And then around the caregivers, right? The caregivers are so critical and important to the lupus patient. And we have created content and resources to educate the caregiver around how to support the patient, but also how to do self-care for themselves. And that piece is critical and important. So I would say as an industry, we have to really, really understand that we have to listen to the communities for which we are seeking to support and create content in real time that's relevant to them. And I would say during COVID, definitely we've had to evolve and as an industry, and what we've seen now is we've been able to create content around really educating patients around how to engage with their physician via telemedicine, right? You think about these common, these things that have been happening, but how do you empower and educate the patient to feel comfortable with that virtual engagement with the HCP, how to journal, really just some of those general tactics, but really make a difference, especially when physicians have less time, right? And then the other piece is yes, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just appreciate that. I actually do want to give the audience a reminder here. I'm realizing that we're halfway through our time and we would love for this to be interactive. So if anybody would like to submit questions for Sharita or for others about lupus or Alzheimer's, please do submit those through the chat box and we'll try to call on you. But I want to talk about the cost of Alzheimer's now, because this is often called the most expensive disease in America. And Ian, can you just talk a little bit about that? We know that it costs, that the costs are huge, but do people really grasp this? And also the part of, the aspect that we have been pouring money into this for a long time and have come up with relatively little in terms of treatments.
Right. So let me try to unpack that a little bit, but I get a little carried away. So stop me anytime you need to. The dollar costs are astonishing and enormous and frankly unsustainable. So in current dollars, by 2050, we'll be spending over $1 trillion a year just in federal funding to deal with Alzheimer's if we don't bend the curve, if we don't have fewer people living with Alzheimer's or living with it better, with a higher quality of life, lower symptom level, shorter duration, et cetera. So we have to bend the curve. We have to advance the science. And let me demystify on your point about the scientific investment that's been made. It's been relatively recent and it's still relatively insufficient. So we are not overspending and underperforming in Alzheimer's science. Think where we were 50 years ago in cancer science and where we are today. It's taken 50 years of sustained, massive public and private investment to get to the point where many, but not all cancers, are treatable, curable, survivable. We aren't there yet in Alzheimer's, but Alzheimer's science and dementia science is relatively much, much younger and relatively underfunded still. So over the last 5 to 6 years, the Alzheimer's and dementia advocacy communities have been remarkably successful. We're very proud of that success in driving up NIH investment in this science. But that's 5 or 6 years. Stacy can elaborate on this, but the average Alzheimer's study takes 17 years. So getting from basic science to breakthroughs, we're not even a third of the way into that journey based on the first of those new dollars into NIH. So we have a long way to go, but the return on investment is going to be phenomenal, not only in human lives and quality of life, but in savings to the taxpayer, savings to the economy, and our role as a global leader. This isn't an American problem, but it's a global problem.
Ian, can I pause
Sure.
you right there? Because I want to actually get Janine's reaction to this. Janine, do you agree that where do you think the funding levels should be compared to where they're at now and where they've been over the last few years? And do you agree with Ian's characterization of what we're investing in Alzheimer's research?
So in terms of Alzheimer's, I agree with Ian's characterization of the more recent substantial investment. And, that is sometimes because, we don't know where those breakthroughs are going to come from, right? So it's critically important that we invest broadly in basic science so we can understand the molecular underpinnings of Alzheimer's disease, lupus, and every other disease. I do agree also with Ian's characterization of the impact of Alzheimer's on society, the economic impact, the caregiving impact. 2/3 of the caregivers are women when their patients are men. And so we do see that this is a broad impact. And we do need more research on a variety of areas, Alzheimer's included, and we need to better understand why there are the sex differences we see. Why do we see different patterns and brain changes over time between women and men? How do we identify those people who have early signs so we can intervene and prevent progression? Why do we see greater rates in African-American populations? Should our inclusion and exclusion criteria be adjusted so that we can get answers faster? Those are just some of the questions that we don't know the answers to. And clearly, because we haven't gotten the answers, that just means it's complicated, and certainly we're not going to give up, but we do need to find some ways to innovate and incentivize the system to work together. And I think we've done that with COVID. We've shown we can work together across sectors and accelerate progress when we put our minds together and develop, de-risk collaboration and make it a space where everybody wins. And I think that has happened to some extent in Alzheimer's, but I do think there's room for more cross-sector collaboration and kind of convergent science, where we converge on the problem and we bring interdisciplinary perspectives, engineers, biophysicists, clinicians, patients' voices, what they notice. And I do want to add also, Paige, because somebody mentioned it before, the patient's voice, we cannot underestimate the importance of understanding what's important to people who are affected by this disease and making sure that we enroll proportions of people who are affected by this disease, a range of people, early, middle, and later stage. We do see some differences in that by sex. So I hope that gets to your question, Paige.
Yeah, and I kind of want to ask a follow on what you said earlier about women being underrepresented in R&D, and particularly when it comes to Alzheimer's. What are some specific ways that we can involve more women, more minorities in R&D, and how should that change the way that research is being carried out right now?
Sure. Just to give you a little bit of figure, a paper that just came out looked across randomized controlled trials in the US and Europe. And so these are both pharma and NIH and federal, all kinds of funders, and found that the proportion of women on average across all those was a little over half. And we know that it's about 2/3 of affected Alzheimer's disease patients are women. So that just gives you a little bit of the number. One of the challenges in that paper, and they highlighted something that's very important, and I'll get to your question, is that only 13% of those studies reported sex-specific results in the journal publications. So there were women in the study, so women were always included, but the studies weren't necessarily designed to answer the question, does this treatment work in women? Does this treatment work in men? Do we see severe side effects in women? Do we see them in men? Are those important clinically? So, and those were not in the publication. So that is an area everyone can help us to work on, journal editors and publishers, especially as those gatekeepers of those publications, because even though the women were included, we don't really understand whether that treatment had an effect in them as well as men. But to your point about inclusion and outreach, and I think Dr. Dorsey mentioned this, we all have a role to play in terms of educating the public about Alzheimer's disease, about lupus, about how important it is for them to participate in clinical research. If you want to help a group of individuals in your community with your background, we need everyone to participate in clinical trials. We get a more diverse representation in the clinical trial, we get better answers for everyone. Without that representation, when we have studies that come out, the clinician, when you come and you have, new onset lupus, they don't have evidence upon which to base their treatment decisions for people like you. And so that's why it's so important across race, ethnicity, age, sex, gender, as many characteristics as possible. And also, we haven't talked a little bit about the social determinants of health and how important it is to include SES, socioeconomic status, education status. That's important for Alzheimer's research, right? We know that when you come in at a different educational level, you're on a different plateau. So we need to have individuals with different educational backgrounds across all sectors and demographics.
Well, and we have our first audience question here, I think related from Billy Jones. So if the Research America folks could unmute his line, I would invite him to ask his question right now.
Hi, yes. Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, great. I was just going to ask to Dr. Buie and Clayton, how do the socioeconomical factors kind of play into the severity of chronic illnesses? And does NIH currently fund this type of research?
So Joy, maybe I can start, or do you want to start?
You can go ahead.
So in terms of NIH funding, and Joy, maybe you can talk about the impact on patients, we do fund research that's specifically designed to address the effect of social determinants of health on chronic disease outcomes. Those are typically associated with a specific disease. So a specific institute will release a funding opportunity that says, we want to understand systemic lupus erythematosus in Hispanic women, or Mexican American women, or this particular group. ORWH, the office that I lead, also has a funding opportunity that's focused on understudied, underreported, and underrepresented populations of women. We call those U3 populations, and we work with multiple institutes and centers on that. So there are a variety of pathways, but let me pass it to Joy to add her thoughts.
Hi, yes, and Mr. Jones, thank you for your question. So socioeconomic factors play a huge role in the chronicity of lupus. And at the LFA, we recently started a health disparities project to really kind of study these factors and really get an understanding of how these socioeconomic factors interact with genes and biology to cause poor health outcomes. And so we know things like the environment, as well as poverty, can limit access to care. It can also create issues with stress that in turn cause higher levels of cellular stress that then lead to poor biological changes and different outcomes in lupus patients. And so one of the things that we know is on the horizon is this field known as social epigenomics. And basically it's a study of how the environment and social factors really interact with the genome to change how genes are expressed. And I think that work is really important, especially for lupus, and we need more of it to be done.
And Joy, just to follow on that, talking about funding for research for lupus, we know there was a recent infusion of funding. I believe at the end of last year, Congress provided the largest ever award for lupus targeted research. And can you share your thoughts on what this means for making progress on future treatments and cures?
Absolutely. This is incredibly important. I think, because we have such few research dollars in lupus, it's very difficult for us to make quick advances. I always look at COVID as an example and kind of what happened to, accelerate the development of a vaccine. And I think, there were not only increases in funding, but there was also an increase in resources in terms of experts who are working on this very difficult problem. And I think if we had the same thing for lupus and Alzheimer's disease, we would be able to quickly advance these fields. It takes resources to make change. And I'm so happy that, lupus is being prioritized by the NIH for sure.
Stacy, I'd like to ask you a question about the regulatory landscape. And I know that we already talked about the accelerated pathway, but can you share more thoughts on what types of shifts you'd like to see that facilitate progress?
Definitely. Alzheimer's disease is one of the biggest unmet medical needs of our time. I think that is the understatement on this panel. Lilly's been committed to Alzheimer's research for more than 30 years. And frankly, for the first time, there are several treatment options on the horizon, and we need to make sure the regulatory system is prepared to assess them with the same sort of lens that's been used to fight the pandemic. I would like to talk a little bit about a risk-based regulatory framework, but in essence, the idea of a risk-based framework is that FDA has been able to apply regulatory flexibilities in a way that acknowledges the significant threat of COVID while also respecting the high standards of review and approval that we've come to expect from them. So, beyond this regulatory framework, I think something else in the regulatory landscape is that one of the most impactful things that happened during COVID is the fact that, we had a near real-time opportunity to interact with the agency and get feedback on our preclinical, clinical development requirements. And this really removed a lot of white space. So this is important when we need answers quickly. So I think from a regulatory landscape perspective, something I wanted to talk a little bit about a risk-based regulatory framework today, since that is what I think you could term what we've observed under COVID. I think under a framework like this, the nature and the severity of the condition, the disease intended to treat, and how well patients' needs are being met by currently available treatments, those are all considered as the clinical and preclinical development plans are being built. And even the risks and benefits that are acceptable and meaningful to patients and their caregivers are very centrally considered. I think some other people on the panel have already highlighted that today. So I think creating this framework where the construct in which we're making decisions about the requirements for regulatory development review are being considered, that is fundamental to making the kind of progress that we need to see in Alzheimer's disease and other chronic and life-threatening diseases. So what do I mean by a risk-based framework? I just wanted to give you a few examples. In the preclinical space, I think we can learn a lot from oncology and the ICH standards that are in place today. Certain non-clinical studies that aren't necessarily needed at the initiation of the patient trials, they can be run in parallel to the patient trials. So that's one way to get the medicine into patients faster. And when the needs justify it, we can even continue treatment beyond the conclusion of the early therapeutic studies without waiting for the availability of longer-term tox studies. So these are all things that we can think about in a risk-based framework where we've agreed that the context of that disease justifies that sort of decision-making. I think on the clinical side, and I do need to be clear that some of these advanced regulatory scientist tools are accepted by regulators in certain circumstances today, but we need greater consideration of these tools to be used consistently. We need greater use of decentralized clinical trials, platform trials, and adaptive trial designs, and even trials that incorporate real-world evidence. I think
Stacey, I'm sorry, when you say decentralized trials, can you explain what that means a little more?
Sure. Decentralized trials is a very general term that could actually mean any amount of decentralization. But I think in the most extreme sense, it means patients participating in clinical trials without going to a physical site where the investigator is and more people going to them. It removes a lot of barriers, creates access to more patients. There's all kinds of different levels of decentralization, but that's the general concept. And it's something that has been vital during the pandemic to keep our clinical research infrastructure moving forward. And it's actually identified as a very promising tool to improve diversity in clinical trials going forward. And so I think as a company, and I know many other companies are very keen to see some of those practices that we've employed during the pandemic carry forward. So I think all of these regulatory science tools, they have to be more consistently and transparently embraced and applied. And the severity of this disease and Alzheimer's, I think, warrants the acceptance of a reasonable level of uncertainty that comes with the use of emerging regulatory science tools. And these are the places where we need to get that experience and put all of our best tools forward. I guess, you know, I want to close by saying that I think what we need in the regulatory landscape is an intentional effort to apply the same sort of risk-based framework consistently and transparently across preclinical testing, across clinical development requirements for Alzheimer's. That's what can make a real difference. It's the shared sense of urgency that we saw for fighting COVID that we need to recreate in other chronic diseases. I think an interesting parallel is HIV. Patients with HIV drove this sort of urgency 30 years ago by driving change in the pathways based on their willingness to accept some reasonable level of uncertainty in exchange for earlier treatment access. And this is what led to the creation of the accelerated approval pathway. This mindset's been very evident throughout the pandemic, and we really need to organize the push for action and respond with that sort of urgency and passion, I think, for Alzheimer's disease as well.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard a couple of you reference coronavirus and how that has sort of served as a model for what many hope could be an accelerated treatment. But I guess I want to play devil's advocate a little bit, because I could see people pushing back and saying, well, obviously COVID-19 was a highly infectious disease. It was new. We didn't know exactly how it was working. And we did clearly, it's obvious why we had this sense of urgency to develop the vaccines and pour all of these resources. And we've had diseases like Alzheimer's and lupus around for decades and decades. And yes, they're tragic and affect a lot of people. But I guess I'm wondering, Stacy, or if others want to jump in on this, how you somehow recreate this sense of urgency that you have during a pandemic. And you can jump in on this, but how do you recreate a pandemic style sense of urgency for a disease that's been around for decades?
So it is not lost on me that coronavirus is contagious and Alzheimer's is not. That said, and with absolute reverence for the devastation that has been wrought by COVID domestically and internationally, more people have died of Alzheimer's disease or with Alzheimer's disease since the pandemic began than have died of COVID. We have a pandemic in Alzheimer's already. Over 6 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's today in the United States and are dying of Alzheimer's today in the United States, and over 55 million globally. Those numbers globally are going to triple over less than the next 30 years. And domestically, they're going to nearly triple. And right now, and for the foreseeable future, Alzheimer's disease is a death sentence. It is a slow-moving, non-contagious death sentence, but is a death sentence. That's what we've got to change. That's the level of urgency that our families and our advocates feel. And I think it's a sense of urgency that the FDA recognizes, that Congress recognizes, that NIH recognizes, hopefully that CMS is beginning to recognize. But, you know, let's again go back to this point that all of these conditions are interrelated, not just lupus and Alzheimer's, everything, particularly later life diseases. If you can even slow down the progression or improve to some extent cognition and function among people with Alzheimer's, even if it's still a fatal condition, those individuals, if they are diagnosed in a timely, accurate, compassionate, and actionable way with access to disease modifying, if not disease curing drugs, they'll be in a better position to manage their lupus, manage their diabetes, manage their heart disease, manage their COVID risk. It is so much harder. And we have seen this play out to the toll of hundreds of thousands of older Americans with Alzheimer's dying during the pandemic. It is so much harder to follow public health guidelines to protect yourself, your loved ones, those who care for you, if you're living with Alzheimer's during a pandemic, than if you're living without Alzheimer's during a pandemic. We have to prevent pandemics. Let's also, at the same time, let's walk and chew gum. Let's solve diabetes, lupus, Alzheimer's, contagious pandemic diseases. We can do all of this, and we have to do all of it at the same time.
Well, thank you. And let's please keep our lines muted unless you're speaking, just to prevent any background noise here. a zoom out sort of question, and maybe this is best for Janine first, and then maybe one or two others who'd like to chime in. But what's one recent research development that gives you the most hope for patients with chronic diseases, whether it's Alzheimer's, lupus, or something else? Janine, let's go to you on that one first.
Sure. So that's a great question, Paige. And I'm going to pick an area. It's not a specific advance, but it is the notion that we can use technology in new ways. I think that excites me because technological advances can be used to create devices that can detect disease. They can be used to design models. For example, the Evatar is a micro model of the female reproductive system. And so it's in vitro ovaries, uterus, and other tissues, but in vitro, so we can model and perturb that system, which is such an advance over animal models, right? That we can use human cells to actually make that. That's a technological advance. Technologies can be used to help us better image, so we can see at a more microscopic level what is going on in that diseased tissue, so that we can intervene earlier. Is this tissue normal, or is it early disease? So I think that technology, by making us new devices, ways to be able to experiment and understand in novel ways and image tissues, targets, subcellular level, is one of the things that I'm most excited about. These are tools. Clearly, we need to put the tools in the right hands and get us all to the table working together to solve the problems.
Thank you. And what about Sharita? Can you speak from your perspective at GSK? What are some treatments that are exciting you?
Well, I would say for us, and I hate to digress, but I really wanted to also highlight for us that what we're seeing that's exciting right now is, and what COVID has really forced the industry to do, is really to better understand at the local level why there are health disparities, and definitely the gaps, the root cause of why they exist. So we're beginning to really address the hard question, bias in healthcare. We're really beginning to say, how can we partner more and collaborate more the way patients need us to? In some cases, for us, we know African-American women are highly impacted by lupus, and how can we show up where they need us to show up? And that may be collaboration with more HBCUs, or collaborating at at hair salons, and really partnering differently to ensure that the products that actually are approved. We spent a lot of time talking about research, but in the lupus realm, we have had treatments for 10 years for lupus, but yet there's still patients that are not even aware of these new therapies. And so for me, I think that's really a human rights problem that we have to begin to think about. How do we break up complacency and build a greater sense of urgency around treating patients, all patients that are eligible and meet the criteria for products that currently exist. So for us, we're excited that, one thing we hate that COVID happened, but it has definitely highlighted the health disparities. And we're now having honest, hard conversations around why certain populations just were not treated effectively. And I think we all have a role to play in closing the gaps that have been identified as a result of that today, right? With a sense of urgency.
Thank you, Sharita. Yeah, and I want to toss it over to Joy, because Joy, you mentioned earlier, just from the patient experience, that many patients with lupus go years before they're actually diagnosed. And it seems like it's one of those conditions where many of us know someone who has lupus, and yet it's not common like, say, diabetes is. And so I could see someone with kind of that range of symptoms going a long time before figuring out what it is. What are some of the ways that people can be identified sooner? And I guess on both ends, right? The patient being more aware of what they might have, and then the doctor being more equipped to try to diagnose them sooner.
Absolutely. I think the work that Sharita and her team are doing at GSK is extremely important in terms of raising awareness around lupus and what lupus actually is. especially in the African American community. There are devastating numbers within African American women in terms of lupus diagnosis. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of knowledge and education in the African American community. And so I think things like, going into these spaces where there are unmet needs in terms of education and awareness is extremely important. I also think that we could do a better job of, having national campaigns around lupus. And at the LFA, we've done that several times, and we continue to do it in order to raise awareness. So just making sure that, educational endeavors are consistently pursued. I also believe that, in terms of educating physicians, we need a curriculum that has been updated with information about lupus that's being disseminated in our medical schools, in our nursing schools, in our PA schools, in our physician or physical therapy schools. All of those are very important, as well as in PharmD schools. All of that's very important because if patients go to the physician and the physician has no clue about lupus, then that prolongs the diagnosis even longer. So I think it has to be a multidimensional approach to raising awareness about lupus, what it is, and how it can be treated, in order to make sure that we decrease the amount of time it takes to get a diagnosis, and patients can have a better chance of not experiencing that organ damage that can be very debilitating and also costly.
Well, we're almost out of time, but one last question for Janine. What would you like to see, or what are your own goals, or maybe not your own, because I know you're speaking for NIH, but when we think about what needs to be done for Alzheimer's and lupus research going forward, what would you like to see happen over the next few years?
So I'd love to see additional pathways for partnership. I think the Advancing Medicine Partnerships, or AMP program, showed us that pharma, nonprofits, federal funders can work together in a way that accelerates progress. And COVID has taught us that too. So let's go to the next level and take all those lessons learned from COVID and have that cross-sector collaboration. So more pathways and platforms for partnership is one. The second is that technology piece, integrating technology and getting more diverse perspectives at the table. To piggyback on what Sharita said, diverse perspectives allow us to innovate. We know that diversity drives innovation. It drives excellence. We have this concept of inclusive excellence at NIH. And so we like to talk about the diversity dividend. And if you implement diverse perspectives, diverse disciplines, interdisciplinary approaches, you're going to ask different research questions. You're going to understand what's important to the communities affected by the diseases. You're going to come up with more diverse and creative ways to solve the problems, and you're going to come up with better answers faster. So that's the diversity dividend. So I would love to see pathways and platforms for partnership, diversity dividend amplified, so we can all maximize that return on the investment that each of us makes in our own sectors, right? We're all making incredible investments, and to turn, for our perspective, to turn that discovery into health for everyone, we've got to embed a lens of health equity. Absolutely, COVID-19 has shown us that health equity is imperative. We're not healthy until we're all healthy. It's pretty basic, especially with an infectious disease, but even with chronic disease. And so now we can better understand through efforts like SEAL and other approaches where we are in the communities, that that's not a one-time thing. You can't just come and consult with the community when there's a pandemic. We understand that's long-term trust that has to be built through partnerships over time. So by way of ending here, the power of partnerships is amazing, but how you apply that power is how you reach the potential, right? And I think we have the potential to do that. And we've demonstrated that in the US response to COVID-19. We have demonstrated what we can do. Let's do the same for other problems and solve them all, if we work together.
Well, thank you to you and to our other great panelists for being with us today. I know I learned a lot from this discussion, and thank you to all of the audience members who tuned in as well. So thanks for watching, everyone.